James Carter pushed open the heavy glass door of the roadside diner, its little bell jingling faintly above him. The smell of fried bacon and burnt coffee hit him instantly, a reminder of the hundreds of diners he had walked into across America. His boots were dusty, his jacket worn, and his military patches, faded but still visible, rested proudly on his chest. He carried himself with quiet dignity, though his eyes betrayed exhaustion from the long miles behind him. The chatter inside dimmed almost immediately. Forks hovered midair, conversations froze, and a hush swept through the crowded room. James wasn't new to stares, he had seen them his entire life. But the silence here felt different, heavier, colder. A family in the corner pulled their children closer, while two men at the counter exchanged knowing smirks, as if his very presence was some kind of joke. James chose a seat near the window, where the fading sunlight stretched shadows across the checkered floor. He set his old duffel bag gently beside him, like it carried pieces of his soul within it. For a moment, he let his fingers brush over the stitched patch on his sleeve. His unit insignia. It had carried him through war zones, deserts, jungles, places where he had nearly given his life for the same country that still treated him like an outsider. The waitress glanced at him from behind the counter, her eyes flicked nervously to the owner, who was polishing glasses a little too aggressively. James raised a polite hand, signaling he was ready to order, but the waitress froze in place. A low murmur spread across the diner. Snickers, whispers, a cough that wasn't really a cough at all. He could feel the heat of their stares pressing down on him like a weight. Still, James sat tall, back straight, posture unshaken. He had learned long ago not to show weakness. He wasn't just a man walking into a diner. He was a soldier, a survivor, and a father. The silence around him only confirmed what he already knew. This wasn't going to be just another meal. Something was brewing in that room, and every second felt like the calm before a storm. The owner, Frank, finally set his glass down with a sharp clink against the counter. His jaw tightened, and his eyes narrowed into slits as he walked toward James. The heavy boots of the man echoed against the tiled floor, each step dragging the silence further into tension. When he stopped at James's table, he leaned forward just enough for everyone to hear and said in a low, biting voice, "We don't serve your kind here." The words sliced through the still air, igniting a nervous chuckle from the men at the counter. James lifted his gaze slowly, calm yet unyielding, meeting Frank's stare with a steadiness that carried decades of discipline. He didn't flinch, didn't look away, just asked in a voice that was both polite and firm, "All I want is a hot cup of coffee, maybe a sandwich." The request was simple, almost humble, yet it carried the weight of someone who had faced much harsher threats than an angry restaurant owner. But Frank's lips curled into a sneer, and he snapped the menu shut before James could even touch it. "You deaf, old man," Frank barked, his voice rising so the entire diner could hear. "This place isn't for you. I said get out." He slammed the menu against the table, the sound making a few of the customers jump. The waitress winced, looking down at her notepad, too afraid to intervene. The couple in the corner whispered to each other, the mother shaking her head, as though silently urging James to leave before things escalated. But James remained seated, his hands folded neatly on the table, every movement deliberate and controlled. The laughter from the counter grew bolder now, feeding on Frank's hostility. One of the younger men muttered something under his breath, mocking James's jacket, calling it old army junk. Another chimed in, questioning if James had even really served at all, suggesting maybe he wore the patches just to gain pity. Their words dripped with disdain, but James's silence only seemed to provoke them more. He refused to rise to their bait, his calm presence almost unnerving in contrast to their venom. Frank leaned closer, close enough that James could smell the bitter stench of cigarettes and whiskey on his breath. "You think this jacket makes you somebody?" he hissed, tapping the patch with a fingerful of grease. "Not in my place. In here, you're nobody." The insult echoed louder than his shout, as if the whole diner itself had conspired to amplify it. Phones came out, recording, eager for the drama. Yet James sat motionless, his eyes fixed forward, a quiet fire burning behind them. He knew something Frank didn't, and that secret alone kept him steady while the storm gathered. James sat in silence as Frank loomed over him, but the owner wasn't satisfied with his quietness. He wanted a reaction. He wanted to see this man break. "What's the matter?" Frank sneered loud enough for the whole diner to hear. "Tat got your tongue, or maybe you don't speak proper English." A ripple of laughter broke out across the room. Some customers shook their heads, others smirked into their cups, but no one dared speak up against the owner. James's jaw tightened, but his hands remained folded neatly on the table, his discipline unshaken. Frank, frustrated by James's calmness, grabbed the edge of his jacket and tugged at it. Look at this old thing. Military patches. Please. He turned toward the crowd and announced mockingly. This guy wants you to believe he fought for this country. Probably just some drifter wearing someone else's coat. The insult drew louder this time, the kind that fed off cruelty. Phones lifted higher, recording every second, eager to capture the humiliation of a man who had once worn his nation's uniform with pride. James could feel every eye piercing into him, every chuckle sharpening the sting of the moment. He thought of the years he had spent overseas, the nights in trenches, the days when he had barely clung to life. He thought of his brothers, in arms, men who had died beside him, and of the flag he had saluted over their graves. And now, in his own country, all of that sacrifice was reduced to mockery by a man who had never seen a battlefield. Yet James did not rise, did not shout, did not give them the reaction they craved. The insults turned sharper, uglier. Frank leaned closer, lowering his voice into a venomous whisper meant only for James. You blowed for nothing. Men like you will always sit at the bottom. And men like me will always stand on your neck. Then he pulled back and laughed, spreading his arms as though he had won some invisible battle. The crowd, caught up in the cruelty, chuckled nervously again, some with pity in their eyes, but none with courage to intervene. And through it all, James's gaze never wavered. His calmness was unsettling, like a coiled spring waiting for the right moment to release. To anyone watching closely, there was something behind his silence, an unspoken weight, a secret that none of them could even begin to imagine. Frank thought he had stripped this man of dignity, but James carried something no insult could touch. Something that, very soon, would shift the entire room and leave them all questioning what they had just witnessed. The moment Frank shoved him, James's coffee cup trembled, the dark liquid spilling in a thin stream across the table. Gasps rippled through the diner, some in shock, others in anticipation. A hush fell over the room again, thicker and heavier than before, as every pair of eyes waited for the veteran to explode in anger. But James only steadied the cup with one hand, wiping the mess with a napkin as though nothing had happened. The restraint in his movements was so precise it was almost unsettling, like a soldier holding back an entire storm inside. Frank, emboldened by James's silence, laughed cruelly. What's wrong, old man? Don't have the fight left in you? His words rang out, sharp and cutting, and the men at the counter chuckled, egging him on. The waitress flinched every time Frank's voice rose, her trembling hands clutched around her notepad. The air smelled faintly of burned grease, but underneath it was something sharper. Fear. James could feel it radiating from the few customers who weren't laughing, the ones who sat frozen, knowing deep down that something wasn't right about how calmly this man endured humiliation. As James rose slowly to his feet, the room seemed to shrink. He wasn't towering, he wasn't threatening, yet there was a gravity in his presence that made people lean back in their chairs without realizing it. His eyes, steady and dark, locked on Frank's. For a brief second, the laughter died down, as though everyone could feel the tension tightening around them like an invisible rope. James didn't clench his fists, didn't raise his voice, he simply straightened his back, the way he had done countless times on parade grounds and battlefields. I'll leave, James said, his voice low but steady, cutting through the air like steel. But remember this moment. His words weren't shouted, but the calmness in them carried more weight than rage ever could. The line hung in the air, unsettling, cryptic, a warning that seemed to go over Frank's head but chilled a few in the crowd. Frank scoffed loudly, trying to cover his unease, but his eyes darted for a moment, as if something deep inside him recognized the danger in a man so composed. James picked up his duffel bag and slung it over his shoulder, moving toward the door with unhurried steps. Every footstep echoed in the silent diner, and with each one, the tension only thickened. The customers shifted in their seats, torn between relief that the scene was ending and dread that it was only the beginning. And as James reached for the door handle, he paused, turning his head just slightly, his voice dropping to a whisper only Frank could hear. You'll regret this. The diner door swung shut behind James, leaving only the faint jingle of the bell and an uneasy silence in his wake. For a moment, the crowd released a collective breath, thinking the confrontation was over. Frank chuckled smugly, brushing his hands together as though he had rid his place of a nuisance. That's what I thought, he muttered, loud enough for all to hear. But just as the laughter began to return, a low rumble broke through the night outside. The sound grew louder, engines, heavy and synchronized, not the kind you'd hear from passing traffic. Customers exchanged puzzled looks, their conversations faltering. Through the diner's wide front windows, headlights suddenly flooded the gravel parking lot. One by one, sleek black SUVs rolled in, their tinted windows glinting under the neon sign. The engines didn't cut off immediately, and the rhythmic hum of idling vehicles filled the room with a strange, unsettling tension. Children pressed their faces to the glass, whispering excitedly, while adults shifted nervously in their seats. No one understood why government-style vehicles were pulling up to a quiet, small, town diner in the middle of nowhere. The doors of the SUVs opened in perfect unison. Men in black suits stepped out, tall and broad-shouldered, their movements precise and deliberate. The reflection of dim streetlights bounced off their dark sunglasses, even though night had already fallen. The unmistakable glint of earpieces tucked behind their ears confirmed what everyone was now thinking, but too afraid to say Secret Service. A ripple of panic swept through the diner. Phones that had been recording the humiliation moments earlier now turned toward the parking lot, hands trembling to capture whatever was about to unfold. The atmosphere inside shifted instantly. The once loud diner had gone so silent that even the faint buzzing of the neon sign seemed deafening. Frank, who only minutes ago had strutted with arrogance, froze behind the counter, his face draining of color. His bravado faltered as he wiped his palms on his apron, darting nervous glances toward the entrance. The waitress backed away slowly, pressing herself against the wall as if she wanted to disappear entirely. The customers, still glued to their seats, could feel that something monumental was about to happen. The diner's door swung open once more, but this time it wasn't James. Instead, a single figure stepped inside, surrounded by 2 agents on either side. His presence filled the room instantly, confident, commanding, undeniable. Conversations stopped before they could even begin. The air grew so heavy it seemed to press down on every chest in the room. No one yet dared to say the name forming in their minds, but every heart pounded with the same thought: someone very powerful had just walked through that door. The diner was frozen in stunned silence as the tall figure stepped inside. His polished shoes clicked against the tiled floor with deliberate authority, each step echoing like a drumbeat in the suffocating quiet. Even before his face was fully visible, people recognized the posture, the energy, the weight of power that seemed to move with him. Gasps rippled through the room as whispers began to break out. Hesitant, trembling. As that? No, it can't be. One woman muttered, her hand clasping her chest as though her heart might burst through it. Frank's eyes widened, his smug expression evaporating in an instant. His lips parted as if to speak, but no sound came out. He gripped the counter edge for balance, his knuckles turning white, sweat already glistening across his forehead. The man who had strutted with arrogance minutes ago now looked like prey cornered by a predator he didn't even know existed. Customers exchanged bewildered stares, some already fumbling to lower their phones in disbelief, unsure if they were allowed to record what was happening. The man moved further into the diner, scanning the room with eyes that commanded obedience. He paused near the center, letting the weight of recognition sink in for everyone. When he finally spoke, his voice was calm, measured, yet it carried the authority of someone who didn't need to raise it to be heard. "I understand," he said evenly, "that a man walked into this diner tonight, and was treated like he was less than human." His gaze shifted deliberately toward Frank, who stumbled backward, the blood draining from his face. The crowd sat in paralyzed awe, unable to look away. Some customers lowered their heads in shame, realizing the ugliness they had silently condoned. Others stared wide-eyed at the unfolding scene, desperate to know who this man was addressing, desperate to see where this confrontation would lead. And then, almost casually, the suited man raised a hand. One of the Secret Service agents opened the door again, and James stepped back inside, this time not as a target of mockery, but as someone shielded by the most powerful men in the country. Frank staggered a step, his throat dry as sandpaper. He tried to form words, but the man in the suit spoke first, cutting through the silence with a line that made the entire room shudder. "That man you mocked, humiliated, and shoved is my father." Gasps erupted like thunder, disbelief spreading across every corner of the diner. Phones shook in trembling hands, recording history as Frank's face twisted from arrogance to horror. The balance of power had shifted in an instant, and now every soul in that room knew they were standing on the edge of something far bigger than a diner dispute. The diner seemed to shrink as the president's words echoed off the walls. "That man you mocked is my father." The room was so silent that even the hum of the old refrigerator behind the counter sounded like thunder. Customers froze in disbelief, their eyes darting between James, now standing tall beside his son, and Frank, whose arrogance had melted into sheer terror. Some dropped their phones, their trembling hands unable to hold steady as the gravity of the revelation sank in. James didn't speak, but he didn't need to. His silence was more commanding than any words, his calm posture radiating a quiet dignity that now shamed every person who had laughed at him minutes earlier. The president, however, wasn't silent. He stepped forward, his voice firm, his presence undeniable. "This is the man who raised me. The man who taught me honor, sacrifice, and respect. And tonight, you treated him like he was nothing." His eyes locked on Frank, piercing through him like glass under a torch. Frank took a stumbling step back, nearly knocking over a stool. The Secret Service moved closer, their dark suits like shadows ready to act at a single gesture. One agent produced a pair of handcuffs, the metallic clink making the hairs on the back of every neck in the diner stand upright. "This isn't just disrespect," the president continued, his tone sharpening. "It's assault, it's discrimination. And it will not go unpunished." The customers who had laughed earlier now sat frozen in shame, some lowering their heads, others unable to look James in the eye. The atmosphere had shifted completely. What was once cruelty was now guilt and fear. Frank tried to protest, his voice cracking as he sputtered, I didn't know." But his excuses died in his throat when the president raised a hand to silence him. "That's the point," he said coldly. "You didn't care who he was, because in your eyes, he wasn't worth respect. But you're about to learn that actions have consequences." The weight of those words seemed to press down on the entire room, suffocating, inescapable. Frank's lips trembled, his eyes darting around desperately for someone, anyone, to defend him. But no one moved. The agents stepped forward, their hands firm on Frank's arms as they pulled him from behind the counter. Gasps and murmurs spread through the diner as the once dominant man was now reduced to a stumbling, powerless figure being escorted out. James stood still, his expression unreadable, his silence more powerful than any outburst could ever be. The president placed a steady hand on his father's shoulder, guiding him toward the best table in the diner. The same people who had mocked and laughed now sat in utter silence, their shame thicker than the air itself, while the weight of what had just happened lingered heavy in every corner of the room. "My father wore this nation's uniform so that people like you could enjoy freedom, safety, and opportunity. He sacrificed more than you'll ever understand. Tonight, you tried to strip him of his dignity, but let this be a lesson: true respect isn't given to power, money, or status. True respect belongs to those who earn it through honor, sacrifice, and love of country. And from this day forward, let it be known, humiliation will never silence the truth, and hate will never erase the worth of a man like James Carter."
If you liked this video, don't forget to hit that like button, share it with your friends, and drop your thoughts in the comments below. Most importantly, subscribe and hit the bell icon so the next secret finds you first.